Hello everyone and welcome to this Whitlam Institute podcast. My name is Leanne Smith and I'm the director of the Institute. I'm speaking with you today from what always was and always will be Gadigal Wongal country, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I am here today joined by my colleague and lead researcher Claire Brolan from the University of Queensland to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and our new policy research that looks at international best practice in how the SDGs are being implemented around the world, in the hope that we can offer some constructive policy options for the Australian government to improve Australia's SDG performance. Hi, Claire.
Hi, Leanne. How are you?
Good, thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
So I thought I might start off by giving a bit of context for why we decided to do this research. Many of you watching would know of Gough Whitlam, Australia's Prime Minister from 1972 to 1975, and perhaps Australia's most progressive, forward-looking Prime Minister. Whitlam's vision for Australia was very much about linking how we engage internationally with what we do domestically. Gough Whitlam was a firm believer in the power of multilateralism and the importance of the United Nations in bringing nations together to solve global challenges, particularly for small countries like Australia, where he thought we could have more impact in those multilateral fora. Gough was very concerned that international agreements, international law, and international collaboration could help impact Australia's political and social policy. And so that interconnectedness between our foreign and our domestic policy was a big part of his approach. That's led us at the Whitlam Institute to work under two policy research themes. One of those themes is Australia in the world, and the other is the future of Australian democracy. So for us, this is where this particular research project sits. For me personally, having worked for the UN for about 10 years, I was working at UN headquarters when the SDGs were being designed, and I had some involvement from a peace and security perspective because I was working in UN peacekeeping at that time. When I came back to Australia, working with the United Nations Association of Australia, I was appointed a UNAA ambassador for the Sustainable Development Goal 16, which is the SDG that relates to peace, justice, and strong institutions. And now it seemed to me and to others that I'm working with that Australia has not really grasped the SDGs as the opportunity they represent for a better future for all Australians. So despite a very thorough 2018 parliamentary inquiry into Australia's SDG implementation, which was full of strong and practical recommendations for how we could make the SDGs part of our strategic direction, as well as part of our everyday policy making at different levels of government, the recommendations have largely been ignored so far. Now, this matters for Australia and for its engagement with the world because Helen Clark, the former New Zealand Prime Minister and the current lead of the World Health Organization's independent inquiry into coronavirus, she noted at the launch of the SDGs in 2015, and I quote, "Sustainable development in the 21st century is not something which happens to somebody else, somewhere else. We all have a stake in it, and every country has work to do to progress towards it." So, although Australia has signed on to the SDGs and has presented its first voluntary review of performance against the SDGs in 2019, the content of that voluntary review has been criticised by some for its currency in terms of the information and the quality of the report. And in any case, the federal government has still to release a national SDG plan of action, unlike so many other countries around the world. Compared to the Australian government, Australian business, academia and civil society are leaps and bounds ahead in terms of their understanding of the SDGs and their importance and their potential. For us at the Institute, and I know for Claire, you as well, this year's bushfire crisis, drought and the global pandemic have provided more evidence than we ever needed that what we need right now is to be strategically prepared for a sustainable future. And we think it's critical that the Australian government at all levels and with real coordination takes leadership of Australia's SDG implementation and brings all Australians into the conversation, because I'm sure there are a lot of Australians who have no idea what the SDGs are. in order to make sure that no Australian is left behind. And we can use the SDGs as a tool to try and ensure that. So that's where we're coming from. And with that, I'll pass over to Claire now. Claire, would you like to introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Thanks, Leanne. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm a research fellow. I'm based at the Centre for Policy Futures at UQ, the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. And my research is at the crossroads of the SDG policy and planning, health and sustainable development, and health and human rights or health justice. So I'm particularly interested in SDG 3, the goal on health and wellbeing, SDG 16 and SDG 17, partnerships for the goals. So that's just a little bit about me, and I'm also zooming in today from Quandamooka territory here in Brisbane, and I wanted to also acknowledge and pay my respects to Quandamooka elders past, present and emergent.
Thank you, Claire. Let's start off with the basics. I'm sure we have a range of people in our audience today. So what on earth are the Sustainable Development Goals and why do they matter?
Sure. So the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, they comprise of 17 goals, 169 targets and a whole plethora of indicators. And they actually came to be in September 2015. Australia was one of 193 countries that came together at a high-level UN summit in New York in September of 2015. And we pledged and committed to implementing the SDG agenda with 192 other countries. So the 17 SDGs focus on social, economic and environmental sustainability across the globe and set out a 2030 timeframe. So from now, another 10 years for implementation and achievement. And what I really like about the SDG agenda, Leanne, is that it's indeed a universal agenda, and it's the shared responsibility of every country, including Australia. So whether you're a low or middle income or high income nation, this is an agenda or a future visioning of and for sustainable development for all people everywhere around the world.
Yeah, that's great. And that's what makes the SDGs different from the Millennium Development Goals that preceded them, in the sense that they're not about developing countries, they're about every country in the world, and that includes Australia. And I think that's something that a lot of Australians in policy and politics have failed to pick up about them.
Yeah, absolutely, Leanne. And the fact that too, that the SDG agenda is very much an agenda that was developed and formulated and constructed by countries. So it's not, unlike its preceding agenda, which was the Millennium Development Goal agenda that came out of sort of the UN excitement and visioning around the Millennium Declaration in the sort of 2000 period. This is an agenda, the SDG agenda, that has very much been developed by UN member states, by countries, by governments, in partnership with civil society and private sector and communities all around the world. So, yeah, it's as I said, it's a universal agenda.
Yeah. So when we talk about sustainability in Australia, I think most people think about environmental sustainability. You've already mentioned that something that's quite unique about the SDGs is that they bring together environmental, economic and social sustainability. Can you say a bit about why this way of thinking, integrated thinking across these different sectors, is going to require something of a paradigm shift in the way politicians and policymakers think about strategic planning for Australia's future?
Sure. The SDG ambition highlights the interconnectedness and multidimensional nature of the development challenges that we face in our world today and their integrated nature. So, and that couldn't be even more better demonstrated than by what's happening with COVID-19. So COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease. It became about because of an imbalance between the environment, between the social, between the economic. And its impact is on further creating imbalance and chaos, really, between the economic, the environmental and the social. So COVID-19 and its impact and you know, thinking about how on earth we respond to this, and very strategically so, reminds us that we cannot look at these great challenges of our times through the lens of one discipline or through one departmental lens in government. That the SDG agenda really challenges us to strive for a paradigm shift in which we, in policy, in planning, among our political leaders, work with community, work with the private sector, work with our Indigenous Australian friends to think about how we deal with these issues in terms of, you know, both trade-offs and wins together.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So maybe now would be a good time for us to just flesh out a bit the overarching objectives of this research that we've done together. And I already mentioned some of the context from our perspective, but what were the big goals for you, Claire, in the research?
Really important, because I think it has responded to three very misplaced imaginings about the SDG agenda among our political elite here in Australia. And I think the first misplaced imagining is that the SDG agenda is a deficit-based development agenda. I get the sense among our political elite that, you know, with 17 goals, 169 targets, it's too big, it's too unwieldy, it's too ambitious. And by looking at best practice case study examples from other countries, for example, and when we're seeing other countries proactively implementing and investing in the implementation of the SDG agenda, we know that's now just absolutely not the case. You know, that this agenda is really being harnessed and actioned by other countries. And if they can, we certainly can do it too. The second misplaced imagining around the SDG agenda in the Australian context, I think, is that the SDGs are irrelevant to us here in Oz, that this is a UN agenda imposed on the Australian government and Australian people by the UN. Again, that's very much misplaced. This is an agenda that was put together and driven by governments and unanimously endorsed at the UN General Assembly by 193 countries in September 2015, including Australia. I think the third misplaced imagining around the SDGs in Australia, Leanne, then is that, okay, if the SDG is at all relevant to Australia, that they're only relevant in terms of shaping Australia's international aid portfolio, or DFAT, our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trades portfolio. And I think whenever any of these three misplaced imaginings around the SDGs are pointed to by political leaders in this country, then the SDG agenda in its entirety is in my experience, pretty usually swiftly dismissed, or it's not critically and very deeply engaged in.
So what we're pushing for is that the government just try and grasp it and start finding ways to implement it. And the research draws out, quite helpfully, I think, some good examples from a diverse range of countries around the world about how they've grappled with exactly the same problem of localizing the SDGs. So Claire, could you talk to us a bit about the methodology of the research, particularly in the context of the case studies you looked at, why you picked them, and what they showed us about how other countries are succeeding in implementing the SDGs?
Sure. So we agreed, Leanne, that it would be really great to look at and learn from three international jurisdictions that were implementing and were seriously committed to implementing the SDGs at the national level and some national level. And we thought, okay, so which three countries should we be looking at? The three countries that were repeatedly pointed to in terms of doing really great policy planning and governance around the SDGs from three different regions, global regions, were Germany, Indonesia, and Mexico. And so I think, Leanne, we agreed on sort of digging deeper and having these countries as our case study countries, because we really like this mix. They're all these countries, like Australia, are part of the G20. They're all middle power nations and really strong power brokers at the regional level in their respective regions, like Australia. We also like the fact that Indonesia is one of our nearest neighbours, you know, a strong player and partner in our Indo-Pacific region. And Mexico too, it also sits on the Pacific Rim. Indeed, we have Australia is trying to really build its strong economic ties and relationship with Mexico through the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a free trade agreement. So, yeah, these were basically the three reasons that we chose these countries. And then what we did was we went and interviewed a series of policymakers who are involved in sustainable development, whether that's whether those policymakers or key players were in the corporate sector or in, you know, government or in public policy think tanks or in academia or civil society, and looked at the complementary literature on those countries and SDG implementation.
Give us some examples of what you learned or things you discovered from the practices in those three countries.
What was most telling is that in all three of these countries, the respondents who we interviewed were stating to us that, you know, of course, political will is key, but political will has to come from the very top, from the national leader. And when you look at each of these countries, indeed, there is really strong and very overt backing of the SDGs domestically by the leaders of all three of those particular countries. And, you know, in Indonesia and Mexico and Germany, all of them actually were very instrumental and pivotal in the country negotiations when the SDG agenda was being put together in 2012 to 2015. So I think that was very, very telling that, you know, culture around sustainable development starts at the very top. And that's what came through strongly in the report findings. Policy, SDG commitments are nice words on paper, but again, if we have those commitments in law, if we have them in our budgets, then they become much more tangible, much more actionable. And usually that happens because there's some sort of national overarching framework or roadmap or implementation plan.
Thanks, Claire. No, they're all really good examples of what we could learn from. Let's turn to the recommendations that the research report makes now. We know there's so much scholarly literature out there and a lot of expertise in the field of sustainability around the SDGs as well. And we wanted our research to draw on all of that wealth of knowledge. So can you just summarise for us just some of the most important recommendations coming out of the research?
There were, I'm just looking at my report now, there were 12 recommendations that came out of the research. The first recommendation is that, well, basically we need in this country to have a national SDG implementation plan. And what we recommended, Leanne, is that the Council of Australian Governments, COAG, should establish a ministerial council with representation of local government. And we suggested that, well, we recommended that this council should consist of relevant senior ministers from each Australian jurisdiction, and that they be given the mandate to together develop this roadmap of action and be accountable to COAG and to the Prime Minister for its implementation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, going even further than that, as post our research, in fact, the national cabinet model in terms of bringing decision makers together, the SDGs represent to me exactly the kind of cross-cutting issue that requires joined up decision making by the different levels of government.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of me thinks that there's no reason why that particular entity couldn't stay in place and transition from COVID-19 response recovery to and management to SDG implementation, particularly given that COVID-19, our recent bushfire crisis emergency, really concerning drought that's occurring throughout Australia really demonstrates how we really need to get serious in this country in terms of implementing the SDG agenda. You know, personally, I think what's really lacking from Australia is a futures vision. And I think more than ever, this is what is needed to give hope to Australians as we go through this particular COVID-19 emergency, and we see the economic, particularly the economic, social and environmental fallout, all the three pillars of sustainable development. And I think this is where we really should be leveraging and harnessing our SDG commitments. I think it's a pivotal moment, I think, in this country's history to really be thinking about futures visioning beyond defence and really thinking about, okay, let's be serious and let's implement the SDG agenda.
Look, Claire, thank you so much for the research. It's been a massive investment on your part, and we've been so glad to partner with you on this important piece of research that we really hope is going to be a constructive contribution to policy making in this country. So to all of you who joined us for the podcast today, thank you for joining us. If you're interested in this topic, please have a look at the research on our website. The report is called No One Left Behind, Implementing the Sustainable Development Goals in Australia. And if you'd like to be part of the effort to help socialise the SDGs in Australia and get these SDGs in front of policymakers at all levels, please get in touch with us through our social media channels or through our webpage, and we'd be very glad to have you join the effort towards making the SDGs something real in this country. Thank you again, and goodbye.